The sixth time he came through, he was already crying, and I understood that the first 5 had been for my benefit. I need to tell this the right way in order, because the order is the only part of it I still trust. If I skip ahead, you'll think I'm building to something. I'm not. I'm just trying to lay it down the way it happened, one car at a time, because that's the shape it came in. My name is Elliot Hare. I'm 34. For the last 6 years, I've worked the manned booth at the Exit 12 spur off Route 219, which is a stretch of divided highway that runs between 2 towns nobody outside the county has heard of. The spur exists because a paper mill used to sit at the end of it, and when the mill closed in the 80s, the state kept the tollway on the books because the bonds hadn't matured. It's the kind of road that only makes sense if you know why it was built, and almost no one does anymore. The booth is a concrete cube with a sliding window and a space heater that clicks on when the interior temperature drops below 58 degrees. I sit inside it from 10 at night to 4 in the morning, Wednesday through Sunday. In an average shift, I process between 11 and 19 vehicles. Most of them are the same trucks running the same routes. I know their faces. I know their coffee orders when they roll down the window with a thermos and ask if the machine inside my booth is working, because it never is. It's been broken for 2 years. Nobody has fixed it because nobody who could fix it knows I exist. I say all of this so you understand the baseline. My job is to sit inside a small lit box on a dark road and take $3.40 from people who could have taken the interstate. Anyone who uses the spur is either a local who prefers the shorter route or a driver who took a wrong exit and doesn't realize it yet. That's the population. It doesn't vary. The night this happened was a Thursday in late October. I remember because I had bought a sandwich at the gas station on my way in, and the receipt said October 23rd, and I keep receipts in a coffee can on the shelf next to the register. It's a habit from an audit 6 years ago. I have every receipt I've generated since the 2nd month I worked there. That coffee can is going to matter later, so I want to establish it now. The shift started ordinarily. A red pickup at 10:14. Exact change. An older woman who I know drives home from her sister's place on Thursdays. A semi at 10:31, no cash, uses the transponder, and I raise the gate manually because the sensor on that lane has a 2-second lag that spooks the drivers. A silver hatchback at 10:47. A young man with a beard who I've never seen before, paid with a 5, and waved off the change. I remember the change because I dropped one of the coins and had to bend down to pick it up, and when I straightened back up, his taillights were already gone. At 11:02, a dark blue sedan came through my lane. I want to be careful describing the car because in retrospect, every detail becomes significant, but at the time I noticed nothing. It was a mid-2000s sedan, dark blue, one of those makes that stops being recognizable once it's a few years old. American, I think. The kind of car you see and immediately forget. The driver was a man in his 50s, clean-shaven, wearing a grey sweater. He handed me a $5 bill. I gave him a 1 60 cents in coins. He said, "Thank you." He drove on. That was the first pass. I logged him because I log everything. On a clipboard beside the register, I keep a running tally of vehicles by time, colour and lane. The state doesn't require it. I started doing it in my 2nd year because the shift is long and the tally gives my hand something to do between cars. In 6 years, I've filled 43 clipboards. They're stacked in a plastic tub in the storage closet at the back of the booth. I mention this because the clipboards are also going to matter. At 11:34, the same dark blue sedan came through my lane. I noticed because he handed me the same $5 bill. Not the same denomination, the same bill. There was a small ink smudge on the upper left corner of Lincoln's face, a curled J shape, and when I saw it a second time, my hand paused above the register drawer for half a second before I made change. I gave him a 1 60 cents. He said, "Thank you." He drove on. I stood at the window a moment after he left. The taillights curved around the bend and vanished into the pine cut, where the road bends south. I looked at the clipboard. I had written him down at 11:02 in lane 1. I wrote him down again at 11:34 in lane 1. I underlined the 11:34 entry, which isn't something I normally do. Here's the part I want to explain carefully. The spur is not a loop. If you drive south on the spur past my booth, you have to go 7 miles before you reach the interchange at the old mill site. And from that interchange there is no returning ramp back onto the spur going north. The only way back to my booth from that direction is to leave the spur entirely, take Route 219 north for 4 miles to the next exit, come back down 219 south, and re-enter the spur at the on-ramp 2 miles above my booth. It's possible. I've seen delivery drivers do it when they miss an address, but it takes at minimum 12 minutes at the speed limit and closer to 17 if you obey the lights at the interchange. 32 minutes had passed between his first pass and his second. That was tight, but possible. I told myself he'd missed his exit, gone up and come back around, and the recognition of the ink smudge was a coincidence born of a long shift and a slow night. I wrote unusual same driver, same bill in the margin of the clipboard, and I made myself a cup of coffee from the thermos I keep on the shelf, and I sat back down. At 12:06, the same dark blue sedan came through my lane. He rolled the window down. He handed me a $5 bill. The smudge was still there, still shaped like a curled J on the upper left of Lincoln's face. He was wearing the same grey sweater. His hair was combed the same way. The overhead light in the booth caught his eyes for a moment, and I saw that they were tired in a particular way. The tiredness of a man who has been awake for a long time and has stopped noticing. I said, "Sir, weren't you just through here?" He looked at me. He did not look surprised. He did not look confused. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has said something you were expecting them to say, eventually, but not yet. He said, "Have a good night." I gave him a 1 60 cents. He drove on. I want to describe what I felt in that moment, because if I don't describe it now, you'll think I had some intuition I didn't have. I didn't. I felt the ordinary discomfort of a small breach in routine. I felt the way you feel when a stranger uses your first name at a gas station, and you can't figure out how they got it. It was uncomfortable, but it was still contained inside the category of things that have prosaic explanations. Twins. A joke, a misunderstanding, a prank. I picked up the phone in the booth. It's a landline. There's no cellular signal in the cut where the booth sits because the pines block it, and the state never installed a repeater. I called the north on-ramp booth, which is manned by a woman named Doreen on the night shift. Doreen has worked the spur for 19 years. I asked her whether a dark blue sedan had come through her lane in the last 40 minutes. She said no. I asked her whether any car had come through her lane in the last 40 minutes. She said no. She said it had been slow all night, that she'd processed 2 vehicles since 10 o'clock, and both of them were the beer delivery for the tavern at the mill site that runs a Thursday drop. I thanked her. I hung up. I stood at the window with the receiver still warm in my hand and looked south down the spur, at the bend where his taillights had gone, and I understood that whatever route he was using to come back around to my booth, he was not using the north on-ramp. There is no other route. I want to be very clear about this. The spur is a stub. It goes south to the mill interchange, and it ends. To come back north through my booth, you have to use the north on-ramp. There is no service road, no maintenance access, no farm cut-through that reconnects to the northbound side. I have driven every road in this county. I have run every plausible loop in my head over years of slow shifts. Because when you sit in a booth for 6 years, you learn the geography around you the way a spider learns its corner. There is no loop. At 12:38, the same dark blue sedan came through my lane. I had been watching for him. I had been standing at the window with my hands on the counter and my eyes on the bend. And when his headlights swept up out of the cut, I felt something in my chest that was not fear yet, but was preparing to be. He rolled up. He rolled down the window. He handed me a $5 bill with an ink smudge shaped like a curled J on Lincoln's face. I did not take it. I said, "Sir, I need you to pull over." He looked at me. His expression did not change. He said, "I can't." I said, "There's a shoulder just past the booth. I need you to pull over and I need to see your license." He said, "I can't stop, Elliot." I want to tell you that hearing my name was the moment everything broke. But that would be a story lie. Hearing my name was the moment I understood I was inside a story that had already been happening for longer than I had been paying attention. My name isn't on my uniform, there is no name tag, there is no window sign. The state does not identify booth workers to the public because of a policy from the 90s after a booth worker in another county was assaulted by a driver who followed him home. My name is on nothing that a driver could see from a car window. My name is on my paycheck, on the tax filings in a state office 200 miles from here, on a lease agreement for an apartment 15 miles up 219, and on the clipboard stacked in the storage closet behind me, nowhere else. I took a step back from the window. My hand went to the counter, and I pressed my palm flat against it. Because the counter is real, and my hand is real, and I needed both of those things to be true at once. I said, "How do you know my name?" He said, "Please just take the money." There was something in his voice that I hadn't heard on the first 3 passes. It wasn't menace. It was closer to the sound a person makes when they're doing something they've done many times before and don't want to do again but can see no way out of doing. It was the sound of an obligation being fulfilled. I've thought about that voice for a long time since, and the only comparison I can find is a nurse changing a bandage on a wound that isn't healing, not tenderness exactly, not resignation either. Something in between that professionals develop and civilians don't. I took the 5. I made change. I gave him the 1 and the 60 cents. He drove on. I sat down inside the booth and I did not stand up for 11 minutes. I want to tell you what I did in those 11 minutes, because that's when I started to become someone slightly different from the man who had walked into the booth at 9:45 that evening. I did not call anyone. I did not turn on the emergency radio. I did not leave the booth. What I did was open the plastic tub in the storage closet, take out the clipboard from the previous Thursday, and check the entries. At 11:02 on the previous Thursday, October 16th, I had logged a dark blue sedan, lane 1, exact change. At 11:34 that same night, I had logged another dark blue sedan, lane 1, 5 and change. At 12:06, dark blue sedan, lane 1. At 12:38, dark blue sedan, lane 1. The handwriting was mine, the pen was mine. I remembered none of it. I checked the clipboard from the Thursday before that, October 9th. Same pattern, same times, same lane. I checked October 2nd, same. I checked September 25th. I checked back through the tub. I checked 11 clipboards. On every Thursday night since the beginning of August, I had logged a dark blue sedan through lane 1 at 11:02, 11:34, 12:06, and 12:38. I had never noticed. I had written the entries down each week and never registered the pattern, because a clipboard is not a thing you read. It's a thing you write on to keep your hands busy. You fill it and you file it and you start a new one. You don't cross-reference October to September. There's no reason to, except that on every one of those previous Thursdays, the log stopped at 12:38. There was no fifth entry. Tonight there was going to be a fifth entry because tonight I had noticed. At 1:10, the same dark blue sedan came through my lane. I had counted down to it. I had sat with my hands folded on the counter and watched the second hand on the wall clock. And I had known, in a way I had never known anything before, that his headlights were going to come up out of the pine, cut at 1:10 and not before. When they did, I felt an odd calm settle over me, the calm of a hypothesis being confirmed. I stood up. I opened the window. I waited. He pulled up. He rolled down the window. He was crying. Not sobbing. His face was still, and his voice, when he spoke, was steady. But tears were running down both cheeks, and his eyes were red and wet, and the tears had been coming for a while, because there was a dampness on the collar of his grey sweater where they had fallen. He said, "I'm sorry. I don't have another 5. I looked down at his hand. He was holding out $3 bills and 40 cents in change. The exact toll. I said, "It's okay. That's the toll. You don't need to give me a 5. He said, "I've been giving you a 5 for 11 weeks. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you always give me change back, and as long as you're giving me change back, I know I'm still going through." I did not understand what he meant. I understand it better now, but at that moment, standing in the booth with the cold air coming through the open window and his tears on the collar of his sweater, I understood only that he was answering a question I had not asked, and that his answer implied a version of this transaction that I was not part of, but that he had been part of for a very long time. I said, "How many times have you come through tonight?" He said, 6, counting this one. I always come through 6. I've been coming through 6 every Thursday since August. I said, "Why Thursdays?" He said, "Because that's the shift I picked." That was the sentence. That was the one that pulled the floor out from under me, not the crying, not my name, not the 11-week pattern in the clipboards. It was those 7 words in his mouth, in his voice, in the same conversational register he had used to say, "Have a good night" an hour, and 40 minutes earlier. "That's the shift I picked." I said, "You picked." He said, "You get to pick. When it's your turn." I picked Thursdays because my wife used to work Thursdays and I liked being alone on Thursdays. I didn't think about what it would be like to do this. I didn't think about the man in the booth. "I'm sorry, Elliot. I'm so sorry." I said, "What man in the booth?" He said, "You." He held the money out to me. I did not take it. I said, "I need you to explain what you mean." And here is where I have to slow down, because what he said next took him about 6 minutes to say, and I am going to try to reconstruct it as faithfully as I can. But you should understand that I was standing in a concrete cube at 1 a.m, being told something I had no framework for by a man who was weeping quietly and holding out $3.40. And my memory of the exact wording is imperfect. What I have is the shape of it. He said his name was Warren. He said he had lived in the county his whole life. He said that in the summer of the previous year, not this year, the previous year, he had been driving home from a wake, and he had missed his exit off 219 and ended up on the spur going south, and he had passed a booth at exit 12 and paid the toll to a man in a grey shirt and a state uniform. And the man had said have a good night, and Warren had driven on. And when he reached the mill interchange, he had turned around to come back, and there had been no way back, so he had taken the northbound ramp up to 219 and come around the long way, and when he passed the booth a second time, the man in the grey shirt had been the same and had said, "Have a good night again," and Warren had thought nothing of it, because why would he? Warren said it took him 3 passes to notice. He said by the 4th pass he understood that something was happening to him that he did not have the language for. He said he pulled over on the shoulder past the booth and sat in his car and cried for an hour. And when he was done crying, a woman in a state uniform had walked up to his window and knocked on the glass and told him he had a choice to make. I said, "What choice?" He said the choice was this. He could keep driving the spur every Thursday night for as long as it took him to get through it. Meaning as long as it took him to come to terms with something in his own life that he had been avoiding. And when he was done, he would be released, and he would not remember any of it clearly, only that he had once had a difficult few months and had gotten through them. Or he could refuse and be released immediately and never drive the spur again, and never have to think about the thing he was avoiding, and never be free of it either. He said he had picked the first option. He said he had picked Thursdays because Thursdays had been his wife's shift at the hospital, and he had liked being alone on Thursdays back when she was alive. I said, "Your wife is dead." He said, "Yes." I said, "When?" He said, 14 months ago. I said, "And the woman in the state uniform, was she real?" Warren looked at me for a long moment. The tears had slowed. His hands were still holding out the $3.40 and his arm was starting to shake from holding them at that angle. He said, "She was as real as you are, Elliot. I don't know if that's the answer to your question, but she was as real as you are." I said, "How many people are on the spur right now?" He said, "Tonight, 2. Me and one other. I don't know who the other one is. I've never seen them. But every Thursday when I come through your booth for the 5th pass, there's another car behind me at the mill interchange, and I've never gotten close enough to see it. I think they're on a different schedule. I think when I finish, they'll still be here." I said, "And the 6th pass?" He said, "The 6th pass is the last one. On the 6th pass, I'm supposed to hand you the exact toll, and you're supposed to take it, and that's how I know I'm done." That's what she told me. She said I would know I was done because on the last Thursday, I wouldn't have any more 5s, only the exact toll, and the man in the booth would take it, and I would drive past him, and I would not come back. I looked at the $3.40 in his hand. I said, "How long have you been doing this?" He said, "I told you, 11 weeks. I said, "No, in total, 11 weeks of Thursdays. But how long have you been in there?" Warren's face did something I don't have a good word for. It sagged a little, not with grief, with the recognition of a question he had been avoiding asking himself. He said, "I don't know. It feels like a long time." I said, "What year is it?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Warren, what year is it?" He said, "I stopped asking after the 3rd Thursday. She told me not to. She said the answer would make it worse. I trust her, Elliot. I don't know why, but I trust her. She's been kind to me." I stood in the booth and I did not move. I want to describe what I was thinking, because if I don't describe it now, you'll think I was afraid. I was not afraid. Fear is a body response, and my body had gone quiet, the way it goes quiet when I have been driving for too long. And a deer walks into the road and time slows down, and my hands make small, precise movements without my having to tell them what to do. I was inside that quiet. I was looking at Warren's face, and I was doing arithmetic. If he had been doing this for 11 weeks of Thursdays, and I had been logging him for 11 weeks of Thursdays, and I had not noticed until tonight then, either the noticing was the mechanism, or the noticing was the end point. And if the noticing was the end point, if the noticing was the thing that made this his last Thursday, then I was the end point. He wasn't finishing because he had grieved enough. He was finishing because I had finally seen him. I looked at the money in his hand. I said, "Warren, what happens to me if I take this?" He said, "I don't know. She didn't tell me. She only told me my part." I said, "Guess." He said, "I think you become someone who remembers. I think that's what the man in the booth is. I think he's the one who remembers so the driver doesn't have to." I said, "How many drivers have you seen on the spur?" He said, "Just me. But I've been counting Thursdays, and I know from the way she talked about it that this booth has been open a long time." I said, "It has." I looked at the coffee can on the shelf where I keep the receipts. I looked at the plastic tub in the storage closet where the 43 clipboards were stacked. I want to tell you now about something I had not thought about in 6 years, because I had trained myself not to think about it. When I took this job, I was 28. I had just come out of what I would now describe as the worst year of my adult life, though at the time I did not have the perspective to describe it as anything. My mother had died in May of that year. I had been the one who found her. I had held things together through the funeral and the estate and the small, mean argument with my sister about the house. And then in September I had fallen apart in a way I had never fallen apart before or since. I had not been able to sleep. I had not been able to eat solid food. I had lost my job at a warehouse because I stopped showing up. I had spent October in my apartment with the blinds drawn, watching the wall. In November I had gone for a drive. I don't remember where I was going. I remember only that I was on 219 and I missed my exit, and I ended up on the spur going south, and I paid a toll to a woman in a state uniform in the booth at exit 12, and she said, "Have a good night," and I drove on. I don't remember what happened after that. I remember that in early December I applied for the job at the booth, and I remember that the interview was short, and I remember that the woman who hired me was not the woman I had paid the toll to on the drive, but that when I mentioned the spur, she had smiled a small, tired smile and said, "We've been looking for someone." I have not thought about that drive in 6 years. I have not thought about that November. I have thought about my mother, and I have thought about my sister, and I have thought about the warehouse job, but I have not thought about the drive, because there was nothing in the drive to think about. I missed an exit, and I paid a toll, and I went home. That was all. Standing in the booth with Warren's money in his hand and the wall clock reading 1:17, I understood that this was not all. I said, "Warren, I need you to sit with me for a minute." He said, "I can't. I have to drive on." I said, "You can. You have $3.40 in your hand, and I have not taken it yet. Until I take it, you have not finished the 6th pass. You can pull over on the shoulder, and you can come inside, and you can sit with me for a minute, and then we can do this the right way." Warren looked at me. He looked at the money in his hand. He looked back at me. He said, "Are you sure that's how it works?" I said, "No, but I think it's how it works tonight." He nodded. He drove forward. He pulled onto the shoulder past the booth. He put the car in park and he turned off the ignition and then he got out. And he walked back to the booth and I unlocked the side door and let him in. He was a smaller man in person than he had looked in the car. That's a stupid observation, but it's true. In the car, framed by the window, he had looked like a driver, standing in the booth in his grey sweater with his hands hanging at his sides and his damp collar and his shoes that were the wrong kind of shoes for the weather. He looked like a widower, which is what he was, which is what I should have seen on the first pass if I'd been looking at him instead of at the money in his hand. I made him a cup of coffee from the thermos. He held it in both hands, but did not drink it. The booth was small enough that we were standing close together, and I could smell the sweater dry cleaning chemicals and something else, something like the inside of a car that has been driven for a long time with the windows up. He smelled like a long drive. I said, "Warren, tell me about your wife." He looked at me. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I think that's what you're here to do. And I think you've been doing it wrong. I think you've been driving the loop and paying the toll and thinking that the loop is the work. But I think the work is telling someone about her. And I don't think you've told anyone about her since she died. I think you've been driving instead." Warren's face did the thing again. The small sag. The recognition. He said, "Her name was Judith. She was a nurse. She worked Thursdays and Saturdays and one Sunday a month at the county hospital. She was 53 when she died. She had a cancer that started in her pancreas, and by the time they found it, there was nothing to do. She lived for 11 weeks after the diagnosis. She died on a Thursday." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have not said her name out loud to another person since the funeral. I have said it to myself. I have said it in the car. I have said it in the kitchen. But I have not said it to another person. My son lives in Oregon. My daughter lives in Maine. They call on Sundays. I have not told them how bad it has been, because they have their own lives and I did not want to be the father who fell apart. So I have driven on Thursdays because Thursdays are when she died and Thursdays are when she used to work, and I did not know what to do on Thursdays." He drank a small sip of the coffee. He said, "The woman in the uniform told me that if I drove the spur every Thursday, I would eventually get to the end of it. She said there was no way to know how long it would take. She said some people took a few weeks and some people took years. She said I would know I was done when I ran out of fives. I said, 'You ran out of fives tonight.' He said I ran out of fives on Tuesday. I noticed on Tuesday when I was buying groceries, I had been paying with fives all summer because the ATM at my bank gives fives and tens and I always took the fives. I ran out on Tuesday and I thought, that's strange. And I did not connect it to anything until I was driving here tonight, and I reached into my wallet at the on-ramp, and I had only one cess and I understood. I said, 'Understood what?' He said that it was the last one, that she had told me the truth. We stood in the booth for a while. I don't know how long. The wall clock said 1:32 when I next looked at it, so maybe 15 minutes. Warren drank half the coffee. I did not drink any. Outside, a semi came up the spur and rolled through lane 2 without stopping, because the transponder handles those, and neither of us looked at it. I said, "Warren, before you go, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, because I think you're the only person who can." He said, "Okay." I said, "How many men have worked this booth since you started coming through?" He looked at me. He said, "I don't understand the question." I said, "The woman in the uniform, she was in the booth the night you came through the first time. She hired me 6 years ago. She said, 'We've been looking for someone.' She is not in the booth tonight. I am." Every Thursday you have come through this booth for 11 weeks. I have been the man at the window. But before you started, someone else was here. And before them, someone else. I want to know how the booth changes hands." Warren was quiet for a long time. He said, "She told me once. I asked her something like that on the second Thursday. I asked her whether the man in the booth was the same every week. She said he was, for a while. She said the man in the booth stayed until his own driver came through. She said every man in the booth had once been a driver, and every driver would eventually be a man in the booth if he chose to stay. She said it was a way of paying it back." I said, "Paying what back?" He said, "The kindness of being let through." I looked at the clipboards in the storage closet. I looked at Warren. I said, "Do you remember paying a toll to a woman in a uniform 6 years ago on a night in November?" He said, "No." I said, "Do you remember a night in November of any year when you did not know where you were going and you ended up on this spur?" He said, "No, Elliot, I don't." I said, "I do." He looked at me. His eyes were still wet, but the tears had stopped. And there was something in his face now that had not been there before. Something like the small compassion of a stranger who has understood, without being told, that you are grieving something you had not admitted to yourself was grief. He said, "Then I think you know what your Thursday is." We stood together in the booth for a while longer. Neither of us said anything. At 1:47, Warren set the coffee cup down on the counter, and he took the $3.40 out of his pocket. And he set the exact toll down beside the cup, and he said, "I'm going to go now. Is that okay?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you, Elliot." I said, "Thank you, Warren." He walked out of the booth and got back into his car and started the engine. I watched him from the window. He put the car in gear. He drove past the booth without stopping, because he had already paid, and his taillights went around the bend at the Pine Cut. And I stood at the window for a long time watching the place where they had been. He did not come through again. I want to tell you now about the rest of the shift, because there is more of it, and the rest of it is why I'm writing this down. At 2:14, a car came up the spur from the north on-ramp. It was a white station wagon. I had never seen it before. The driver was a young woman, maybe 25, alone in the car, with red-rimmed eyes and a wedding ring she was not wearing, but had tied on a chain around her neck. She handed me a 20. I gave her 16 and 60 cents in change. She said, "Do you know how to get to the mill interchange?" I said, "It's 7 miles down. You can't miss it." She said, "And there's no way back on this road?" I said, "There's a northbound ramp at the interchange. It'll take you up to 219, and you can come back around." She looked at me. She said, "How long does that take?" I said, "About 32 minutes, if the lights cooperate." She nodded. She said, "Thank you." She drove on. At 2:46, the same white station wagon came through my lane. She rolled down the window. She was crying. She said, "I think I missed my exit." I looked at her for a long time. I said, "It's okay. It happens. That'll be $3.40. She handed me a 20. I looked at the 20. There was a small tear along the top edge, a curl of it. The shape a bill takes when it's been folded and refolded in the same place many times. I recognized the tear the way I had recognized Warren's ink smudge, and I understood that she had been giving me this 20 for weeks and I had not noticed. I gave her 16 and 60 cents in change. She said, "Thank you." She drove on. I stood at the window, and I did not move. I want to tell you what I did next, because it is the reason I am writing this down, and it is the reason I am not going to tell you my last name, and it is the reason the coffee can with the receipts is going to matter. I went to the storage closet. I took out the plastic tub. I checked every clipboard, and I found the white station wagon at 2:14 and 2:46 on every Thursday going back to the middle of August. There were 4 passes logged on each of those Thursdays: 2:14, 2:46, 3:18, 3:50. Tonight there would be a 5th, because I had noticed. I sat in the booth and I thought about it for a long time. I thought about Warren. I thought about my mother. I thought about the drive in November 6 years ago that I did not remember. I thought about the woman in the uniform who had hired me and said, "We've been looking for someone." I thought about the receipts in the coffee can, which represented 6 years of small, ordinary purchases. 6 years of a life I had built one gas station sandwich at a time in a small apartment 15 miles up 219. 6 years of not thinking about my mother. 6 years of not thinking about anything. I thought about the young woman in the white station wagon with the wedding ring tied on a chain around her neck. At 3:18 she came through. She was crying harder. She said nothing. She handed me the 20. I gave her the change. She drove on. At 3:50 she came through again. She handed me the 20. Her face was so wet that her eyelashes were stuck together in point, and she was breathing in the small, ragged way people breathe when they have been crying for a long time and have stopped being able to control it. I gave her the change. She drove on. I stood at the window and I waited. At 4:22 she was going to come through for the 5th time. I knew this the way I had known Warren was coming at 1:10. I knew it in my body. And when she came, I was going to have a choice to make, because I had noticed her, and noticing was the mechanism. And if I took her money on the 5th pass, she was going to be released, the way Warren had been released, and someone was going to have to remember for her. That was the arrangement. That was what the woman in the uniform had built into the booth. Someone drives. Someone remembers. The remembering is the toll. I thought about what Warren had said. The man in the booth stayed until his own driver came through. Every man in the booth had once been a driver, and every driver would eventually be a man in the booth if he chose to stay. I understood standing there at the window that I had been the driver once. I had driven the spur in November 6 years ago. I did not remember it because I had been let through. The woman in the uniform had taken my money and she had remembered for me. And then when it was her turn to be let through, she had hired me. She had put me in the booth. Not because I owed the booth anything, because the booth had been kind to me, and the way you honour a kindness that large is by being ready to give it to the next person. I had been ready for Warren tonight. I had noticed. I had taken his money. He had been released. But I was not ready for the young woman in the white station wagon. I did not want to remember her grief on top of Warren's, on top of my own, on top of 6 years of Thursdays I did not yet know were coming. I did not want to be the man in the booth for the rest of my working life, taking money from people who did not know they were grieving and holding their grief inside my head so they could drive on without it. At 4:11, I picked up the phone. I called Doreen at the north on-ramp. I said, "Doreen, it's Elliot. I need you to do something for me." She said, "What?" I said, "When my relief comes at 4, tell him I went home sick. Tell him I left a note in the booth. I'm going to leave a note in the booth." She said, "Are you sick, honey?" I said, "No, but I need you to tell him that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Elliot, Is this about the sedan? I didn't answer. I did not know how she knew about the sedan. I did not ask. She said, "You do what you need to do. I'll tell him." I hung up. I wrote a note. It said, "Family emergency. Coffee thermos still warm. E." I set it on the counter beside the register. At 4:16, I put on my jacket. I took the coffee can of receipts off the shelf because I did not want to leave 6 years of evidence of my life inside the booth for whoever came next. I put the can under my arm. I unlocked the side door. I walked out to my car in the small lot behind the booth. It was cold. The pines were dark. The road was quiet. I could see in the distance the taillights of a semi moving south on the spur, and past that, the small yellow glow of the mill interchange, and past that, nothing. I sat in my car with the coffee can on the passenger seat, and I did not start the engine. At 4:22, I saw headlights come up out of the pine cut from the south. The white station wagon. She was making her 5th pass. She would come to the booth and there would be no one at the window. There would be a note on the counter that said family emergency. Coffee thermos still warm. She would sit at the window for a moment, confused. She would look at the note. She would put the 20 back in her wallet. She would drive on uncharged because there was no one to take the toll. And then next Thursday she would come again, and the Thursday after, and the Thursday after. Because the arrangement required that someone take the money on the 5th pass, and I had refused to be that person, and until someone else stepped into the booth, she would keep driving. I want to tell you that I started the car and I drove away and I went home and I never went back. That is not what I did. What I did was sit in the car with the coffee can on the passenger seat and watch her pull up to the empty booth, and I watched her sit at the window for what must have been 3 minutes, and I watched her read the note, and I watched her lower her forehead to the steering wheel and stay there. And then I got out of the car. I walked back to the booth. I unlocked the side door. I walked to the window. She looked up when I opened it. Her face was destroyed. She did not say anything. I said, "I'm sorry." I had to step out for a minute. "It's $3.40. She handed me the 20 with the small curled tear on the top edge. I gave her 16 and 60 cents in change. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Thank you." She drove on. She did not come back at 4:54, which would have been the 6th pass on the old pattern. She was released. I stood at the window and I felt her leave the road, the way you feel a train leave a station when you are standing on the platform, a quiet pressure change in the air of a place that had been holding something and was now not. At 4:31, my relief came. He is a heavy man named Bertram who has worked days for 20 years and is filling in on my shift for a week because someone I have never met is on medical leave. He walked in the side door and he saw me at the window and he said, "Thought Doreen said you went home sick." I said, "I felt better." He said, "You look terrible." I said, "I feel terrible. I felt better an hour ago." He laughed. He hung up his coat. He asked how the shift had been. I said, "Quiet." He said, "Good." I gathered my things. I picked up the coffee can. I walked out to my car. I want to tell you that I drove home and slept and woke up in a life that had gone back to being ordinary. That is not what happened either. What happened is that I drove home and I sat at the kitchen table in my small apartment 15 miles up 219, and I took the receipts out of the coffee can and I laid them out on the table in chronological order. 6 years of gas station sandwiches and coffee refills and the occasional pack of batteries. I looked at them for a long time. I was looking for evidence. though I could not have told you evidence of what. Toward the bottom of the pile, from the earliest weeks I had worked the booth, I found a receipt I did not remember keeping. It was from a gas station on 219 South, dated November 14th of the year before I started the job. The receipt was for a coffee and a package of aspirin, purchased at 11:47 at night. I had no memory of buying either, but my handwriting was on the back of the receipt, in pencil, in the small, careful print I use when I am writing something I want to remember. It said, "The woman in the booth said, 'Have a good night. I think I have to go back.'" I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I understood, sitting there, that I had known. 6 years ago, on the drive I did not remember, I had known enough to write it down. I had bought a coffee and an aspirin at a gas station on 219 South, and I had written a note to myself on the back of the receipt. And then I had gone home, and I had put the receipt in a coffee can, and I had forgotten. When the woman in the booth hired me a few weeks later, I had forgotten. When I started logging vehicles on clipboards in my second year, I had forgotten. When I started keeping the receipts as an audit habit, I had forgotten. But some part of me had known that the receipts mattered, and had kept them, and had waited. I want to tell you that I burned the receipt. I want to tell you that I threw the coffee can in the dumpster behind my apartment building and drove into work the next Thursday and quit. I want to tell you that I moved to a different county and got a job in a warehouse and never thought about the booth again. That is not what I did. What I did was put the receipt back in the coffee can. What I did was put the coffee can on the shelf above my kitchen table. What I did was drive into work the next Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and every Thursday since. Warren was released. The young woman was released. But there will be others. There have always been others. Every Thursday there are 2, and one of them is a driver I have been logging for weeks without noticing, and one of them is someone I have not started to notice yet. I am the man in the booth. That is the shift I picked 6 years ago, on a night I did not remember picking anything. I was let through, and the way I honour that is by staying, and by noticing when it is time to notice, and by taking the exact toll on the 5th pass, so that the driver can be released. The clipboards are still stacked in the plastic tub. The coffee can is still on the shelf above my kitchen table. The receipt from November 14th is still inside it. I have not told my sister about any of this. She calls on Sundays. She has her own life. She would not want to be the sister who found out her brother had fallen apart. I have not told anyone. I am telling you now because I have been counting my 5s. I bought a coffee at the gas station on my way in tonight. The receipt said October 23rd, 1 year to the day since Warren came through the booth for the last time. I paid with a 5. The cashier gave me a 1 and 60 cents in change. When I got to the booth, I put the change in my wallet, and I noticed that I did not have any more 5s. Only 1s. I had been paying with 5s all summer because the ATM at my bank gives 5s and 10s, and I always take the 5s. I ran out tonight. I don't know what the 5th pass looks like for the man in the booth. Warren did not know either. He only knew his part. I know mine, or I thought I did. But sitting here in the booth at 10:47 on a Thursday in late October, with a wall clock ticking toward 11:02, and a plastic tub of clipboards in the storage closet and a coffee thermos on the shelf, I'm starting to understand that there is a version of this arrangement I have not thought about, and it is the version where the man in the booth is also released, eventually, by someone he has not yet noticed. I'm watching the pine cut. I am waiting for headlights. I don't know whose car it will be, or what she will hand me, or what small mark will be on the bill so that I recognize it on the fifth pass. I don't know whether I will notice her tonight or next Thursday or in 3 years. I don't know whether the person who takes my toll will be kind about it. The way I tried to be kind to Warren, the way the woman in the uniform was kind to me on a night in November 6 years ago that I still do not remember, and probably never will. I know only this. When I run out of ones, when I have only the exact toll left in my wallet, when I hand it to whoever is standing at the window of a booth I have not yet been sent to, I will know that it is my last Thursday, and I will drive on, and I will not come back. Until then, the shift is mine. The heater has clicked on. It is 57 degrees inside the booth. The wall clock says 10:59. In 3 minutes a car will come up out of the pine cut, and I will not know yet whether it is the one. I will log it on the clipboard. I will take the money. I will make change. I will say, "Have a good night." That is what you say. After all, that is the small kindness the booth was built for. After all, someone said it to me once, and I did not know I needed to hear it, and it saved my life. I hope when it is your turn, and it will be your turn, eventually, on some road you did not mean to take, in some booth you will not remember paying, I hope the person at the window is kind. I hope they notice you before you have to ask them to. I hope they take your money on the fifth pass and let you drive on. And if you are ever the person in the booth and you see the same car come through 6 times on a Thursday night, I hope you understand what the 6th pass is for. It is not for the driver. It is for you. Take the money. Say thank you. Let them go. The rest is the shift you picked.